Hello and welcome to this PowerPoint on the Probation Service, covering assessment components 1.2 and 3.1 of the WJEC Criminology Level 3 qualification. Now, since I did my last PowerPoint on the Probation Service a few years ago, a lot has changed. So I've updated, and this is the latest information that I have on the Probation Service. So a lot of textbooks will now be out of date, but this PowerPoint certainly isn't. So without further ado, let's crack on. So the Probation Service, which was formerly known as the National Probation Service, it's part of the Criminal Justice Service, it's part of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, which used to be known as the National Offender Management Scheme, NOMS. As I said, it's part of the Ministry of Justice, and the current Probation Service was created on the 26th of June 2021. So just after lockdown finished, some dramatic changes were brought into the Probation Service. These were planned to be implemented in 2020, but obviously COVID set those plans back a bit. So all this has occurred since the 26th of June 2021. So why has there been a change? Well, prior to 2021, about 60% of the probation service was run by community rehabilitation companies, CRCs. Now, these were private businesses. They were funded by the Ministry of Justice through taxpayers' money, and they were paid for by meeting various targets that were agreed in their contracts. And as I said, they dealt with roughly 60% of all cases. Now, in 2018, 2019 and 2021, the CRCs missed their targets, and a very damning report by the House of Commons said that £342 million had been spent on these CRCs with no clear benefits, and so the decision was made to do away with them. And here we've got, if you look at here, the Dorset, Devon and Cornwall Community Rehabilitation Company. It had its started in 2018, rated as inadequate overall. So just the sort of example I'm talking about. So CRCs were not doing their job. And I've given you a bit of evidence here. The following slides provide an insight into some of the issues that surrounded not just the probation service, but these CRCs. So here you can look at the number of individuals under probation supervision at the end of March 2020. There were about 241,000, so nearly a quarter of a million. 63,000 on community orders, suspended or sentence orders 37, nearly 38,000, under licence nearly 69,000, and in custody 77,000. So a huge amount of people being dealt with by the probation service. But if we look at it, those sentenced to a community or suspended sentence, where accommodation was known at the start of their sentence, we had 94% had accommodation, 6% were homeless. When they were the prisoners who were being released from custody, 81% had accommodation, 19% were homeless. When we get to the education, training and employment, anyone sentenced to a community and suspended sentence, 43% were employed, 56% were unemployed. People released from custody, 12% employed, 88% unemployed. And look at these reoffending rates. Community sentences, 31%, custodial, 61% if you get a less than 12 month, and longer sentences, 27%. So clearly things weren't working very well. And if we look at the overall ratings, here are your CRCs. Overall ratings: requires improvement, 19 out of the 21, inadequate, 1 of the 21, and only 1 out of the 21 was rated as good. Whereas if we actually look at the probation service, so this was the government run part, the 40%, they did 6%, they did 40%, that was 5 were good, 2 were rated as requiring improvement. So definitely slightly better on the government run section for those that were inspected. So clearly it wasn't working. The CRCs weren't doing their jobs. The decision we made to abolish them, and of course then COVID hit. So eventually, after a lot of planning, the new system came into effect on the 26th of June. So basically this happened. All National Probation Services divisions and privately run companies merged into a new unified public sector probation service, which was divided up into 12 distinct regions. So here are the regions. In the southwest we are region G, so you can see quite a big region, but they were merged together. And this is how the changes occurred. So pre-unification, we had 21 CRCs, there's the various areas for them. That gradually changed into a more unified model, and then 2021, that's that final one that I showed you on the previous slide, and you can look at those at your leisure. It gives you an idea of who's doing what. Okay, so the new model for England and Wales has the following key elements. So for a start, all sentence management activity moves to the probation service. So any community sentence, any things like tagging, unpaid work, reallocating prisoners who've been released from jail on probation or on licence, all that moves to the probation service. As I said before, they're organised into 12 regions, and those regions are overseen by a regional probation director who is, they've got accountability for both the probation service and for any contracts that they decide to give to private companies. And for the Southwest, it's Angela Cossins, here she is, that's our regional probation director. So they've amalgamated the CRCs and the probation services, and then it's the director who makes the decision whether they are going to buy out anything to private companies. So unpaid work, accredited programs, other interventions, resettlement services, all now delivered by the probation service. And they've introduced this new thing called the dynamic framework, which is a commissioning mechanism which allows the regional probation directors, so like Angela here in the Southwest, to buy in, procure services that are specific to the people, the parolees, the people that the customers, for want of a better word, of the probation service. So that could be to do with training needs, accommodation, employment, all those sort of things that we saw in the previous slides haven't been dealt with very well at all. So the dynamic framework, as I said, this has only been going since June 2021, so it's very hard to see what effect it's really had so far because the reports aren't out yet. But the idea is that it's used to commission services for individuals on community orders and those supervised on licence in the community. So let's say the way I see it as working is, let's say you've got someone who's been given community order. They're a serial shoplifter because they've got a drug addiction. So what you might do is commission a specific service for that person to deal with their drug addiction, thereby ensuring that they are that they're not reoffending. That's the thinking behind it. Or it could be that you've got when it looks at work, if you're taking prisoners out of prison, let's say you've got a shortage of plumbers in the Southwest, so it would make sense then to train people up in prison to be plumbers, as opposed to, let's say, plasterers if there isn't a shortage. So you commission service that meet the needs of the people that you are dealing with. That's the dynamic framework. So it's dynamic because it moves, it changes as things change within society. But as I said, it hasn't been going long, so it's hard to see whether it's had any effect at all. So there's the quote: to directly commission rehabilitative services in a way that encourages the participation of a range of suppliers, including smaller suppliers, and is responsive to the needs of local areas. So it's become much more local, fixed to the needs of the specific area of the probation service. And so here's some of the things that they are looking at in these this dynamic framework. So it could be providing accommodation, education, training, employment, help with finance, benefits, debt advice, drug dependency and recovery or alcohol addiction, whatever, personal well-being, women's services, service for young adults, etc. All those have been linked in England and Wales. So that's the thinking behind the probation service. How's it funded? Well, it's funded by the taxpayer as part of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. As we saw in my previous slide on the prison service, HMPPS got 4.6 billion shared between prisons and probation, and probation service has got approximately 1.14 billion of that, and there is how that expenditure was broken up, and you can see that the prisons and the probation service got that, probation got that, and between it, that's how it was split up. So community interventions got 487 million, Wales got 61, England got 428, reducing reoffending 5 million, electronic monitoring, so tagging 110 million, probation reform at 56 million. So that's how the money was broken up. So what are the latest figures in 2021? Well, we've got 234,827 people under probation supervision in this country, of which 68,273 are under community orders, and I'll explain a little bit more about those in detail later on. 40,210 are serving suspended sentences. So if the court gives a suspended sentence, that person with a suspended sentence will come under the responsibility of the probation service, just as anyone with a community order will. 62,684 have been released on licence, so any prisoner that has been released on parole, on licence and prison will come under the responsibility of the probation service. And we've got 69,409 on custody probation orders. Now, you probably won't have heard of a custody probation order. So those are for serious offences that deserve a custodial sentence, a prison sentence of 1 year or more. And if the person, the accused, is 17 or older and they agree to the order, what they get is time in custody followed by supervision by a probation or officer in the community. And that supervision lasts between 1 and 3 years. So you would probably, let's say you're due to get a 2-year prison sentence, quite often that would be reduced to 1 with this probation supervision. So you have 1 year in prison and then 2-3 years supervised by probation. So that is what a custody probation order is. You're sort of in custody and you're sort of not. It's a half and half. So 69,000 people we've got on those. So let's look at community orders. So if a magistrate or indeed a High Court judge gives a community order, then as we know it's mainly magistrates, that could be a curfew, it could be an exclusion order, in other words you're not allowed to go to certain parts of a certain town. It could be that you're required to live in a certain area or in a certain type of place. You might have to attend a group program, alcohol addiction, anger management, drug treatment, whatever. And also unpaid work, undergo unpaid work such as community payback, as we see being done here. And there are others as well. If we go down the route of the suspended sentence, that's when an offender is given a custodial sentence of between, well, it's normally 14 days and 2 to 2 years, or if it's a magistrate's court, 6 months. The judge or magistrate can choose to suspend the sentence for up to 2 years. And what that basically means is the person doesn't go to prison immediately, but they're given the chance to stay out of trouble. And they are given certain requirements that are set out by the court. So it's basically another chance. And if you mess it up, that's it, you're out. So the court can impose certain requirements that are linked to a suspended sentence. There's 13 of them. They might put all 13, very unlikely, and they'll choose from several of these. So it could be doing unpaid work, it could be being subject to a curfew, undertaking a treatment program for alcohol or drugs, being subject to some sort of rehabilitation activity that they have to do. And there are many more, but basically if the offender doesn't comply with the requirements, or they are convicted of another offence during the time of their suspended sentence, then what's likely to happen is they'll get the original custodial term. So they'll get the sentence, if let's say they had a year's suspended sentence, they'll get that year's sentence, and they'll get the other sentence added on to the end of it as well for the new offence. So it does hold a sort of a sword over the sword of Damocles, for a bit of Greek there, over their heads, you know, to make sure that they behave themselves during that time of the suspended sentence. And then released on licence from prison. When a prisoner is released into the community before their full prison sentence has been served. Used to be called parole, it's now called released on licence. And prisoners serving 12 months or more are normally released on licence halfway through their sentence. That's normally how it works, if they behave themselves. And again, the licence will normally have requirements attached to it, just like the suspended sentence will have requirements attached to it. So if you are a prisoner released on licence, you've got to be of good behaviour, not behave in a way that undermines the purpose of a licence period. These are the requirements of a licence. You can't commit any offence. You've got to keep in touch with your supervising officer, which would be your probation service officer, in accordance with instructions given by the supervising officer. You've got to receive visits from that probation officer according to the instructions that the probation officer gives them. And you've got to reside permanently at an address approved by that probation officer. And of course, if you don't, and you breach the points of your licence, back to prison you are called. So back you would go. And here's a wanted poster for this lad here in Bristol who has broken the terms of his licence. And there are more terms as well. Oh, I've just killed there. You're not allowed to undertake work or a particular type of work unless your probation officer approves it. You've got to notify the probation officer in advance if you're going to undertake any type of work. You're not allowed to travel outside the United Kingdom except with the permission of your probation officer. And it's worth, I put this up, it's worth thinking about this. There's a sort of myth that, you know, loads of prisoners released into the community without any monitoring. Well, the reality is the expectation for the parole board is that every prisoner released by the parole board is subject to these strict licence conditions. So bans, restrictions on contacting children, victims, entering certain areas, mobile phone and computer use, travel, as well as regular lie detectors or drug tests. If breached, they could go back to prison immediately. There you go, another parole breaker. And there are other additional conditions that the parole board could bung in. So they could require you to live in a certain place. They could restrict where you can and can't live. They can, as they said previously, stop you making contact with a specific person. You could be required to participate or cooperate with a program of set activities, such as, you know, drug rehabilitation. You know, there's certain things you can't possess, ownership of specific items or documents. You've got to disclose information when asked. You might have a curfew arrangement. Freedom of movement could be restricted, and again, you could have a supervision in the community by an organisation or a responsible officer. Actually, I'm going to go back there. No, I'm not. I'm going to carry on. You can look at that other myth that I put up there for you to think about with the probation service. So, moving on to key responsibilities. What does the probation service do as well as all the other stuff we've looked at? Well, the other thing they do, and we did this when we looked at the court, is they will prepare pre-sentence reports for courts to help them select the most appropriate sentence. And that factor about the probation service is often forgotten by students when they're writing their exam answers, so do remember that one. They will also manage approved premises for offenders with a residence requirement on their sentence. So if you're living in a, let's say, a bail hospital or a bail hostel or a halfway house out of prison, if that's where you'd be required to live, that is what you must do, and the probation service will run those type of centres, so be aware of that as well. Obviously, they will work with prisoners prior to their release on licence from prisons, because they'll get them ready with things like being able to sign on for benefits, making sure they've got a job to go to, making sure they've got accommodation prior to release, because that's important. And they will help all offenders serving sentences in the community, we talked about this before, to meet the requirements ordered by the court. So the courts say, well, I want to tag on this person, probation service does it. If they say I want unpaid work, the probation service monitors it. If they say I want anger management courses for this person, the probation service do it. And the other thing they've got to do, which is also often forgotten, is communicate with and prioritise the well-being of any victims of serious sexual assault and violent offences when the offender's received a prison sentence of 12 months or more, or is detained as a mental health patient. So if you've been a victim of a serious sexual assault and a violent offence, and the person has got more than 12 months, they have got to work with those victims to help them. That is the expectation of the probation service. So another responsibility that they have there. So how do they work? For my final slide, with the other agencies of the criminal justice system, well, obviously they work with the courts because they're preparing that pre-sentencing statements. They also are then managing community sentences that have been imposed by the courts. When we go to the police, they'll be informing them of anyone who's broken the terms of their licence, so the police can then arrest them and return them to prison. They'll obviously work with the prison service because they'll be working with offenders, getting them ready for release, work, accommodation, social security in terms of the licence, etc., etc. And they will work with some charities and pressure groups, finding suitable support programmes for offenders. Hopefully that all makes sense. If you want to see how the probation service used to be, you can go back and look at my previous PowerPoint on the probation service that isn't updated 2022. I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you soon. Take care.